Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this episode of A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist and former Pentagon analyst, Paul Buchanan. And in this episode, Paul and I will discuss the politics of desperation. And this topic flows on from our discussions about long transitions and the moment of friction. Some of you will have seen that episode only a couple of episodes prior. Now, in Paul's notes, and I'm going to refer to the notes here, Paul writes, as the old status quo begins to crumble under the weight of friction, political leaders and elites invested in it get increasingly desperate, leading to more dangerous decisions, more acute moments, and increased chances of mistake, miscalculation, and unanticipated backlash. Now, the politics of desperation, Paul adds, accentuates an ongoing downward spiral. And the politics of desperation takes form in different degrees. And this is my intro kicking in here. For some, the risk of losing is merely a dent in a leader's ego, reputation, a political party's standing, and an awakening that voters have moved on from their style of politics. But for others, a loss can prove and will prove potentially to be devastating to them personally and leading in some cases to criminal sentencing. So Paul and I today, we're going to discuss examples of the politics of desperation as Paul will define it, and we will assess a selection of risks as the world rests upon a cusp of significant elections and an unknown future in some regards. So with all that said, and before we deep dive into this issue, remember, if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, and if you're over on Facebook, do feel free to come over to YouTube and to be able to interact with your comments and questions on that platform. We find that YouTube is actually it excels in that kind of live interaction way. So with that said, and I should just add too, that if you do make comments and interact with us, your comments and questions may actually be included in the program. So with that said, let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who is waiting online to get this episode underway and to discuss the politics of desperation. Tēnā koe, Paul. How are you today, Eho?
I'm doing very well, Selwyn. It's always good to see you. And I'm hoping that seeing you will bring sunshine to the west coast of Auckland. The listeners may like to know that Selwyn's on the east coast, a couple hundred kilometers away from where I am on the west coast of Auckland. It's been raining incessantly out here, and he's telling me it's dry over there. So, yeah. So as he mentioned, we might as well be living on different islands. But no, always good to be back. And yeah, you introduced it very well. Refresh the listeners' minds a little bit, especially those who have followed us for a while there. And I'll say that what precipitated this show was recent events, particularly the behavior of Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. Both are leaders who are increasingly desperate in their actions. And that got me thinking about others as well. As many people know, I study Latin America. Nicolas Maduro stole an election in Venezuela. He's decided to double down. The guy who won, Gonzalez, a former diplomat and professor, has just flown into exile in Spain because the Maduro forces are cracking down. The repression is getting more serious. There's 2,400 people have been put in jail. Anyway, he's decided to go for broke, if you will. And I thought, oh, this is interesting because it follows on something that A View from Afar has been covering for some years now. And it basically goes, but was something that I didn't think of. So this is all new to me in a weird way because we've established that international relations, global affairs, is now reaching the culminating point of a process of systemic transition that actually began in 1990 with the end of the Cold War and then was accentuated by 9/11 and the subsequent war on terrorism and the likes. And there's many layers of complexity to this transition. But what we have said and mentioned before is that one of the hallmarks of the transitional moment in world affairs, and mind you, it's a transition from one status quo, which was the liberal internationalist status quo, to another one, which is as of yet uncertain, but we know will be multipolar. Where we had the Cold War was a bipolar world. Then there was the unipolar moment where the US was the so-called hegemon. And now we're moving into something different whose final contours have not yet been established. And the defining aspect of transitions is norms erosion, rules erosion, and conflict as the system's regulator. And we've talked about this at some length. Well, what I hadn't anticipated was where we've arrived right now. I knew that as norms violations became more frequent, let's say, for example, the behavior of the PRC in the South China Sea, where it's simply ignoring international judgments against it, violating the laws of the sea, and continuing with its island building project. It doesn't care. Obviously, the use of chemical weapons in Syria against the resistance. The invasions, I would include the invasions of Iraq by the United States, but certainly the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. These are all violating international norms. And then there's assorted and sundry other violations of humanitarian law and those sort of things in scores of countries. And so it's a bad moment, basically, because the rules no longer apply. Well, that brought us up a few weeks ago to discuss the moment of friction, which is basically a moment when force meets force. There's no more diplomacy. There's no more trying to accommodate, compromise. States and non-state actors have decided to go for it using their resources unilaterally against antagonists, opponents, and even innocents from time to time. And so we dwelled on that moment of friction. We pointed out some areas where it occurred, the obvious areas where there's open conflict. But what I hadn't anticipated was what happens when people who are invested in the old status quo realize that they're going to lose or they have something to lose. And so, when you said it well, people either have everything to lose or nothing to lose. Either way, it's not good. Okay, if they feel that way, no matter whether it's everything or nothing, they tend to get reckless. And that's born out of desperation. It's born out of the fact that the old status quo is gone, the new one's in the making, and so some leaders under pressure have gotten increasingly desperate, and that's extremely dangerous for world affairs because there's nothing to check them. There's nothing to rein them in. And I'll give an example, and we can start off then, illustrating with many cases. So let's be very clear. Benjamin Netanyahu has been charged and is pending trial on corruption charges, serious public corruption charges that could see him sent to jail for a lengthy period of time. The only thing that is preventing him from going to trial is his holding public office. And he sits atop this teetering right-wing coalition of misfits, hardcore Zionists, some mentally unstable people, in my opinion. And that's all that is there between him and jail time. He has now substituted Israel's public national interest for his own personal interest. And he's going for broke. Let's put it very clearly. He ordered the assassination of the quote-unquote moderate Hamas leader who was negotiating a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange. This moderate, and I'm sorry, I forget his name, but was getting close. He had the Qataris on board. He had the UAE on board. He had the United States on board. And Netanyahu ordered him killed. And we may have talked about that in the past. It was intriguing how they assassinated him, but they did. There goes the moderate. The person who replaced him is the military leader of Hamas in Gaza, okay, a hard liner. And as soon as he was named the new leader, obviously negotiations came to an end because he's got a much more militant stance. And interestingly, the United States declared him to be a terrorist. Now you'd say, well, of course he is. Well, it's a matter of debate whether a resistance fighter who uses the tactics Hamas uses is a bona fide terrorist, but I'll concede that point. But it's interesting because if you're designated a terrorist, you cannot travel freely. So he can't leave Gaza. He can't go to the UAE or Qatar to resume the negotiations that his predecessor had established. So this conflict is going nowhere and is only getting worse now that Israeli is trying to clear what they call our Hamas encampments on the West Bank. So now the conflict is moving thoroughly into the West Bank. My point in saying all of this is that Netanyahu is desperate. And he's desperate to save his own skin, and he's dragging Israel and Israel's relationship with the rest of the world down with him. Let's be very clear. The relationship between Israel and the United States will never be the same. If Trump wins, that'll be a pause in a long-term disengagement between the United States and Israel. The U.S. public has fundamentally shifted its opinion about Israel. They're no longer the white-hatted saviors, the last bastion, of civilization in a dark, hostile Arab world. That is gone. Some right-wingers may still believe that. Some in the Republican Party may adhere to that. But the vast majority of Americans see Israel for what it was, for what it is.
And there's a generational shift on that point too, isn't it? The younger ones stretching right up into the early 30s are pretty critical of really policies that blindly support what they are witnessing daily, hourly, occurring with the United States weaponry over there in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank territories increasingly. Just wanted to add that in. It's something that's not going to change. from the point of view of the old order because they're all dying off. It's a simple transition of age. And that's something that Israel's having to wake up to, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I mean, very good point. And it gets even more interesting. We're going to discuss Trump in a few minutes. But also remember, now that it's been revealed that the Russians have actually deeply penetrated the Republican Party and conservative circles in the United States with their narratives, one of which is anti-Israel. And so this tenant communications front, because it turns out it wasn't a legitimate communications business, with all these right-wing podcasters and media figures and whatnot, they've been parroting Russian lines, some of which include very strong anti-Israeli lines, because the Russians are not big supporters of Israel, to say the least. So, we're getting all sorts of interesting mixes. But, and again, we'll get to Trump. The issue is this moment of desperation for Benjamin Netanyahu has become a moment of desperation for the state of Israel. It's become a moment of desperation for the Middle East, because what he's brought with him in his desperate attempts to save his own skin from personal injury in the form of trial and conviction has created the crisis with the Houthi and with Iran, where we now see exchanges of fire directly on Israel and between Israel and Iran, Houthi on Western shipping interests. I mean, the thing has escalated to a point that it may not be resolvable peacefully anytime soon. And that's the thing, is we don't know how this will end. But what we can say is that the conflict between Israel and Palestinians, not just Hamas, is not going to end anytime soon. In fact, Netanyahu's actions will prolong this conflict rather than resolve it. And it may be time for Western leaders who have some degree of influence on Netanyahu, and that's increasingly diminished, tell him that his personal troubles notwithstanding, there are bigger interests at play than than his personal fortunes. Now, that brings me to the second example of desperate leadership, which is Donald Trump. We won't get into rehashing, what's happened in the last 3 months, but let's just say that bringing Harris into the game has turned the tables on him. We talked the last time how it was amazing that his team did not have a plan B to deal with anything other than Joe Biden. So they were focused on Biden. They knew they could beat Biden. And I guess they didn't take seriously the possibility that Democrats would realize that Biden had moved from being an asset to a liability, and it was time to convince him to leave, which they were within their rights to do. This was no coup. He was the nominee, but he resigned. There was nothing untoward in the way the Democrats did it, contrary to the right-wing narrative. Well, because they didn't have a good plan B, Donald Trump has engaged not only in increasingly unhinged rhetoric, which from my perspective, since I don't like him, now that we have Biden out of the picture, we can focus on Trump's age and his cognitive decline, which to me appears to be accelerating under the pressure of a quite possible loss in early November. And so what has happened? Not only has he gone to the tried and true tropes of republicanism, which is crime, inflation, and migration, but he's throwing out increasingly outrageous dog whistles that are completely untethered from reality. For example, that you send your kid to school on a Monday morning, and the kid does not show up until a few days later and has switched from a he to a she because the schools performed surgery on them. These are things he has said. I'm not making this up. Now, if you take a deep breath, you would think the media would say, this guy is nuts. But he continues. He says that in several states, they wait until babies are born so they can execute them. And that way they don't have to call it abortion. But they execute babies as a matter of course. No one does that, period. There are grievously ill children who go through live birth but are brain dead, who have been choked off by the umbilical cord. My first son would have had that happen to him and needed an emergency C-section in order to survive. But had he tried to have a natural birth, he would have been born dead, strangled by his own umbilical cord. So there are instances where kids are born live, but they are not viable. That's not what Trump was talking about. He was talking about executions. That's nuts. And so on and so forth. I mean, he's now pushing every race button he can possibly push. And it's clear he's not thinking about the country. I mean, I sit and watch some of his antics, and I think to myself, the United States is in very, very serious trouble, not just because he's even around, but the fact that, they're not taking stock of the inanities. The fact that he's calling, basically, the subtext to this is calling for a violent uprising in the event that he loses, and that's the key thing. In November, if he loses, he will not accept defeat. Instead, he will call his people to the streets. And they have a plan for that. They're not going to go to the U.S. Capitol, where they can be surrounded easily by now a well-prepared and forewarned National Guard. They are going to go and march on state capitals. And they will be aided and abetted in red states by the likes of Governor Abbott in Texas. And you may have the beginnings of at least a state-by-state civil war. Because he doesn't separate the national interest from his own personal interests. And his rhetoric suggests that.
I'd just like to pick up on a little bit of context on this too. An interesting thing that's been observed from us way over here in the South Pacific, and that is that, certainly after Biden exited the program, if you want to put it that way, and Kamala Harris becomes and cements in a clear campaign trajectory as a potential President of the United States come November 5th. One would think that the early polls indicated that she was well on track for that. The Democratic convention occurs. The Democratic Party gave every indication it felt very confident, and confidence obviously attracts confidence. There's a situation where Trump was squeezed out of the media. And the more he was absent from the media, the more extreme his targeted attacks became. The more extreme his lines became. What he was pitching to appeared to be right at the heart of his more extreme base than anything else. The weird thing is that the more extreme Trump appeared to be getting in his comments and interviews or on the rallies and on the stump, the more he was able to get back into the media. And it seemed that the interview with Kamala Harris on CNN, for example, with Dana Bash, seemed to be the peak of where she was. If you look at the timeline of the polling that is going on, Now, for those that are watching this on video, they will be able to see up on screen as some of the most recent polling that has been going on. And what we're seeing now is Trump firming up in the polls and an averaging of the polls. Or if we look at first instance here on screen, I'll just make reference to it verbally so those that are listening to it as opposed to watching this podcast know what we're doing. The New York Times Siena College poll taken between the 3rd of September and the 6th of September shows that Donald Trump, and this is in the popular vote, I must add, is sitting on around 48% and Kamala Harris on 47%. If we scroll down the New York Times reportage that came in overnight New Zealand time, and we're sitting on the 9th of September now, which is the 8th of September on a Sunday evening in the United States, we can see in the important states that will determine the outcome of this election. If we look at Wisconsin, it looks like the Democrats have baked it in pretty well there. That Harris is sitting on 50%, Trump is on 47%. If you look at Michigan, it's a bit closer, but the Democrats have got quite a strong hold there with 49% and Trump on 47%. If you look at Pennsylvania, there were some scary polls for the Democrats last week. This New York Times poll comes in with Harris on 49%. Trump on 48%. Nevada, well, that's got closer for Harris on 48% and Trump on 48%. You know, Nevada was out there on this particular poll some weeks ago, but Harris has pulled back there. Georgia, once again, Harris is on 48% and Trump's on 48%. North Carolina, 48% and 48%. Arizona, Trump 48% and Harris 48%. If you look at a comparison perhaps of the averaging out of polls, the New York Times is reporting that the Times Siena poll is showing Harris overall 47%, Trump 48%, but polling average 49% to Harris and 47%. So that's important to see, an evening out of the polls. Sorry about all these numbers, by the way, I'm throwing a lot on you, but you'd be picking up the trends here. The Wall Street Journal poll, for example, has Harris on 48%, Trump on 47%. The big one here that the Democrats would see hope in is the Ipsos ABC poll, and that's been pushed by ABC overnight as well, with Harris on 52% and Trump on 46%. Paul, it seems to me that what we're at is a point in the timeline toward the United States presidential election where it is the tracking can go either way. It seems that the more extreme Trump becomes in his comments, his rhetoric, the more he pulls back. You would think he would shrink. That if he's speaking to his most extreme base, that would scare off reasonably minded voters. But it seems the contrary. So it seems to me like we've got a situation with Trump and the Harris campaign here where the undecided votes are not convinced. They're not convinced that Harris has done enough to explain what they can expect. And that I would imagine for many in the United States is a scary proposition that irrespective of what we think of Trump, irrespective of how extreme his comments are, this is so close. And it gets back to the topic today that you've so rightfully raised and defined out for us, that there's a desperation in his mood at the moment. But if he sees some sort of reward in the polls, albeit the popular polls, then maybe the desperation, the politics of desperation becomes even more intense. And you know what it's like when politicians get into this frame of mind and perhaps get over the line. They see that extreme elements of politics of desperation as the way forward. And of course, we know that Trump has so much to lose should he lose this election, potentially even liberty. So I want to bring it back to you now within that context. and see what you make of that, what we can expect perhaps to see from the characters in this. I know the debate is only coming up in a couple of days after this podcast is recorded, and that perhaps is where the Democrats and Kamala Harris are intending to really put her out there so that people are satisfied that they know what she represents at the very least. I'd like to hear what you feel within the context, obviously, of our topic today.
Well, you're right. I mean, Trump has everything to lose, and so he's, again, he's voicing very unhinged things. I happen to think the Democrats are keeping their powder dry. I think that you're right. The debate. I personally think if she does to him what she did to Brett Kavanaugh in the congressional hearings for his nomination to the Supreme Court, he will tear Trump. She will tear Trump apart, and he may not be able to control himself even with a muted mic, because he's a serious misogynist. He doesn't
especially
like.
if she adds things like others, like the Mooch has made reference to, who knows obviously Trump very well, having been on the inside in previous campaigns, and he says if she starts hitting him on, that's an old idea, or that's coming from the old camp, and so that he's small. This is that she'll trigger an emotional response from Trump that he won't be able to contain. That'll be an interesting thing to see how the voters adjust to that. But back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, she's got to be presidential. So I don't think, you may recall that in the convention, Barack Obama, said something along the lines as, what's with his obsession with crowd size? And he made a hand gesture that could be interpreted as referring to genital size. I don't think she's going to go there, but if she does, I think he'll lose the plot. But there are many other ways, less crude ways, to emasculate him, and I think she will, particularly on issues of policy, because he's not a policy person. And now let me explain. I mean, this may not resound with listeners as much as it did with me, but one of the reasons I think that he's increasingly desperate, besides the fact that the polls have shifted. Again, I still think it's fairly early days. The only poll that matters is on November 5th. But he continues now to refer, well, I'll even back up. How odd is it that you have a presidential campaign where he spends his time lamenting the fact that the U.S. is in decline, that it's a crappy country, that it's, he uses vulgarities, right? He uses obscenities now in his speeches. And it's all because it's overrun by criminal migrants and all that sort of thing. So the campaign is 100% negative. He offers no hope for a better future except to billionaires. And I'll mention one billionaire in a few moments. It's all gloom and doom. The Democrats, on the other hand, are trying to, and having seen that, the Democrats want to go with a more positive image, that it is not like Trump makes it out to be. In fact, socioeconomic indicators are not the lies that he's saying. Crime is not up, particularly in blue cities and states.
Yeah, just on all of this, you were an intelligent, reasonably minded man who has developed your professionalism within a fact-based analysis for your entire career. The truth means something to you. But it's like with Trump, if he says it 3 times, it's, like past extreme regimes. Say something 3 times, a lot of people start to think there's something in it. And when truth has been given out the window and you're still holding up at, 48% on some polls to Kamala Harris, a serious candidate, on 47, there's something majorly wrong. And it seems to me, getting back to the topic of our episode today, that there is no holding back the nonsense that comes out of a candidate's mouth when he sees himself being rewarded in the polls when he's gone off the reservation. So I wonder about really, where we are. We are a long way down the track on needing a democracy that is based on fact to be debated seriously. It seems that it's about show. It's about what are the optics? Who looks the strongest? For example, we've got Cliff, and I apologise, I don't mean to single you out here, but I think Cliff in the audience has raised something here. He says, and I'll bring it up on screen for those that are watching, Kamala is an airhead. However, her duo CNN interview with Walz was hopeless. Walz looked more presidential, not her. So once again, we've got somebody in the audience that enjoys our podcast who's talking about the optics. And I wonder whether or not there is a large section of the independent voters that are waiting to be convinced that are giving up on the sensible debates. But we've got the debate in 2 days, haven't we, Paul? And that would be interesting to see what happens. But I despair as much as you when fact-based analysis or fact-based debate goes out the window. One would imagine that a reasonably minded person would discount the candidate that is pushing that forward, but it doesn't seem to be happening, at least in the United States at this particular time.
Yeah, but let me return. I disagree with Cliff, but that's why we have horse races.
Yeah.
I think she's anything but an airhead. But let's return to the politics of desperation. And this may be the former academic coming out of me, but where I finally said, okay, this Trump guy is really losing the plot, as if that hadn't occurred now for 8 years, was when he started calling her in particular a communist and a socialist. The first time I saw that, I almost fell out of my chair because the stupidity is so strong in that characterization, the moronicy of that comment. I mean, I was just like, not only do you not get to be vice president of the United States by being a commie, but it fails. No one's scared of communists anymore. This generation of voters, they didn't live in the 1950s. The Red Scares don't matter in the way they used to. Now, yeah, some geriatrics, stupid geriatrics, will go, oh, commies, oh my God. So, I mean, and then he obviously doesn't know the difference between communism and socialism.
Yeah.
I don't even want to get into whether he knows what democratic socialism is versus social democracy. But that'd be way too much of a mind blow for that guy. But the point is, you're just, yelling stupidities into the wind. Now, here's the key point. With desperation, you lose sight of the objective of reality. Do you think he was there 3 days ago? He talked to the Economic Club of New York, a bunch of Wall Street bankers, hedge fund managers, a bunch of economists. And what he said to them was utter gibberish, utter, unadulterated gibberish, particularly the comments about childcare, which just went off into Never Never Land. And then the comments about tariffs, that somehow him imposing tariffs was going to offset the billionaire tax cut. that he's proposing to do. It was,
it's crazy. I would suggest that there may be something in this, that all of this nonsense talk is about the optics of trying to look tough, look strong, look big, talk big. And if we look at the polls, we dig in on the demographics, we see a gender bias toward Trump with the United States voting males of all age groups, even the young ones. There's a real gender difference between where male United States voters, even in Generation Z, where they're going to place their vote, the males over to Trump in large amounts, and the polls that are showing are digging into this particular question. Clearly, women of all voting generations are really on the Kamala Harris side for many reasons. If we get down to his talk on the economy, you know, it's almost like they know what they're going to get with Trump, and it's extreme, it's erratic, it's loud, it's brash, it's crass. And all of that seems to be presenting as some sort of Frankenstein version of what strength is. And I mean, from a view from afar, we are about looking at it from a distance. What I see there, even if Trump is beaten, I see a very sick society that is rewarding somebody for what would appear from the outside to be extreme personality disorder, as opposed to intellect, rationale, advocating policies that's going to make life better for many. And the concerns from outside are extreme. What does this mean for the rest of the world? Which is a secondary question to the primary questions, obviously, that United States voters are trying to confront here. But that's my response to this. I get a sense that there's no winning back those that are committed to vote for Trump, and they're in huge numbers. The battle here seems to be that the Democrats have baked in a very solid coalition as well. But the debate is the swinging voters, the uncommitted voters, that seem to be waiting to be convinced not to vote for this guy. And that'd be an extreme concern if there's elements of reality in the yet to make a decision demographic in the United States on that point.
yeah, I mean, we'll see. The what I was thinking is, of course, I mean, the popular vote is the ultimate judge of a candidate. But when he talks the way he does, what do the Wall Streeters think? You know, what are the heavy hitters of industry looking at this lunatic ranting, looking at the race baiting? I mean, you know, all the ugliness, the negativity. What are they thinking? Because they have profit margins to protect into the future. And a maniac is not going to help them preserve their profitability. Sure, he's got a few fossil fuel billionaires on his side. He's got casino billionaires, you know, people who would benefit from him deregulating certain industries that are notorious for not being forward looking. But the really smart heads, with the exception of one or two, they got to be questioning whether this was the right choice, even though Republicanism is traditionally the better choice for big business. Now, here's where I see desperation in adjacent corners of the universe. My consulting firm maintains a Twitter account. I'm not going to honor it by calling its different name just because the weirdo who runs it happens to be obsessed with the letter. But that weirdo is now ranting and raving every day on his platform, parroting not only Trump lines about migration, but Russian lines. He's parroting Russian lines. Now, he owns the platform. He encourages deranged right wingers to run all over that place. But it seems to me, since this person believes in that replacement theory, he's really worried that white people are going to be replaced by brown people, and that's part of why he wants to get to Mars. I mean, this is why this guy's out there. And so my point is this: he is desperate. He is now exhibiting the signs of desperation, where he will reproduce lunatic fringe stuff on a platform that he happens to own because he's very rich. My thought is this: my older son lives in Arizona, and he's not political the way I am, but he's political. Special education teacher, so he sees children with needs. He knows the value of education. And he said to me, very recently in our weekly, Skype talks, he said, "Papa, you should see the political ads." He goes, "It's beyond a circus at this point, because," he goes, "you don't get them in New Zealand, but we get the local ads. So for, people running for local office, and some of them are MAGA." And then he goes all the way to the national level. And he said, "Look, it's completely unhinged on the Republican side." And he goes, "The amount of right-wing ads that feature people with guns shooting things," he goes, "it's off the charts." And they're not talking about bread and butter issues. Because I said to him, so they're talking about a living wage. They're talking about, tax credits for parents to send kids to school. He goes, "No, they're talking about Mexican hordes coming across the border. They're talking that they're going to take your guns."
The politics of fear and extremism.
Completely.
Yeah.
But again, fear of transgender people. I mean, there's this whole line that school shootings in recent years have been committed by transgender people. This is being pitched by the
and
Republican
it doesn't matter
Party.
that there's no empirical evidence to support such things. It doesn't matter to them. They're just pushing it down people's throats. One of the things that does worry me in the polling area, and I don't want to make this an episode about polling, but it is that phenomenon where we saw it in Brexit in the UK, right? Where it looked like Brexit was going to be lost, that the people in the UK were going to vote to stay in the EU, and every sensible debate and evaluation and assessment would suggest that there were good reasons for it to stay there. And perhaps retrospectively, the kind of problems that Britain is facing in many respects can be attributed in part to exiting. But what the polling was missing was that the majority actually voted for Brexit. And it's almost like when someone rings up from a polling organisation, that the person perhaps knows that what they're intending to do is weird and irrational by voting for a particular thing. And so they don't say they're going to. And, we've seen in the past that Trump, he actually lags in the polls compared to what he produces sometimes. And so these polls give me the creeps, to be honest, to put it in a Kiwi way. The thing is we said that we would raise up some debate about some of the risks. And you mentioned Russia. And there's something here, once again, that Cliff mentioned in the comments there. He's saying, Pablo, so he obviously reads your blog, Paul. What is the outcome for Ukraine war? Will it end if Trump wins? Will it continue, and he puts in brackets, endlessly, if Harris wins? And I guess what he's doing there is he's testing out, in a way, that Trump's supposed strongman presence on a world stage, as he is characterising himself to the United States voting public. Is that real? Or is, for example, Anthony Scaramucci correct, where he makes comment of and observations that actually Trump he bows down to strong leaders like Putin and gives examples of when this occurred, when he was president, where, for example, he came out of a meeting with Putin and said, well, I actually believe Putin when he told me that Russia didn't interfere in the United States elections in 2016, that my intelligence people are wrong. So what are we going to get there? If the relationship exists, it seems to me that Trump doesn't actually have the cred or the strength to be able to address something that he is saying in the campaign that he had addressed before he has even signed in on the presidential warrant. So, well, that's my point. Where do you see this type of issue?
Well, and I was about to go to Ukraine and Russia as another example of the politics of desperation. But let me say this: I tend to look at Trump, his track record. He is the field marshal of defeat. He won in 2016, but he was defeated in 2020. And for the most part, the majority of the people that he has backed in congressional races in 2018, 2020, 2022, they have been defeated. His coattails are not an easy ride. I think of that idiot Herschel Walker in Georgia that Trump backed because he's a former football player. Although the man, let's just say, is missing a few brain cells. And I think that, that is going to weigh in the voting booths in November. I think that the polls are what they are. I happen to be very, very skeptical of polls for a number of reasons, some informed, some not so informed. But I think when people go in there, a lot of folk will say, we're tired of the circus. Absolutely tired of the circus. The big risk to the Democrats winning is apathy, that people just get turned off and they believe the narrative that Harris is a communist airhead. I personally think you can be one or the other, but you can't be both. But hey, if people want to believe that, they may just sit it out. For women, the stakes are way too high. And now for men, we'll see, because your point is well made. He likes to look tough, but the more he whines, the more he looks like, a miserable little coward. And so I think a lot of, men who are comfortable in their skin, not incels, not these right-wing, jacked up steroid influencers, I think they'll go, the guy's, he doesn't have a grip. And he's substituting his personal fortunes for the national fortune. Because again, he's been cut every break possible. His sentencing has now just been delayed until after the election. The court cases are all in abeyance until the election. I mean, he's been given every break. But I think what will happen, if he loses, then the Republicans are going to turn on him because they've got to kill him off. See, if he is not charged, tried, and convicted with a possible jail cell, he is going to remain as a political force for some time to come. He is to my mind, he is a cancer on the body politic of the United States. And so if he loses, even though he goes through the shenanigans of saying it was all stolen, which he's already setting up, it'll be for the Republicans to finally kill him off. Now, how does that influence Ukraine and Russia? I see in President Zelensky and Putin two desperate men. Putin is desperate because he thought that he could do a lightning invasion and decapitate the Ukrainian regime, remove the leadership, and the Ukrainians would welcome the Russians as saviors, sort of the delusion that George W. Bush had with regards to Iraq. It turns out that was not the case, and the Ukrainian resistance, they don't want to be Russians, even though many of them are Russian speaking. Now he's in a quagmire. This is his Vietnam. And he can either escalate completely out of proportion to whatever it was, not that the Ukrainians can provide in resisting, but anything he wanted from the start of this war. If he escalates, where they're going on that crazy train ride is, someplace he probably doesn't want to be. Because remember, he's consolidated NATO. And that's going to be important because NATO is going to deal to Trump if Trump wins in a very different way than during Trump's first term. On the other hand, Zelensky's getting desperate because he's not getting the weapons he needs from the West to win a decisive victory in his own country. He still has to recover the Donbass region. So he engaged in a very high risk maneuver, which was to enter Russia, the Russian motherland. And they've been extraordinarily
the first
successful.
time since the Nazis invaded in World War II.
It's a very big deal.
Big deal. Imagine if that was the United States, say Mexico went off the reservation and at one point in the war, they went right into New Mexico, for example. That would be such a huge deal. So I'm just giving a comparison on what it must be like for the motherland, from the point of view of impregnable fortress that it has been since 1940.
Well,
so
it's
huge.
The stakes are huge because Putin is looking increasingly like a paper tiger. He promised his people that he would repel this attack right away. They now have 340 square kilometers of Russian land, including some towns that offered no resistance to the Ukrainian forces, which suggests that those towns' loyalties are a bit divided. He's got to do something, but now he's caught between a rock and a hard place. What they've opted to do is bomb civilian centers and power infrastructure. So, no concern about human rights and the laws of war. Nah, none of that. Reports are now they've been doing summary executions of Ukrainian troops, thinking that will destroy Ukrainian morale. It may or it may not, but I have a feeling that's not going to work. But it's because he's now has to confront escalation as a serious thing. And I get the feeling that his military commanders, as much as they don't tell him the truth, and this is a trait that he shares with Trump, no one around him is telling him the truth. In Trump's case, sir, you sound unhinged. In Putin's case, sir, we don't have the troops and weaponry skilled enough to repel these Ukrainians. And yes, they're using this land grab as leverage to get their land back, but we're not going to be able to push them out, unless we resort to tactical nukes, but we'll be nuking them on Russian soil. So what you have now is, if you will, the compound desperation of a Zelensky, Putin, all increasingly desperate about their personal positions. Of all of them, the one who seems to be the most focused on the national interest is Zelensky. And but he's under siege. Things are not going as well for the Ukrainians as they had hoped, because the West is wavering, as the West is wont to do. So I think that we need to think about the U.S. elections as as the most important U.S. election, certainly of the 21st century, and possibly beyond, because it'll mean either a further descent of the United States into something. It's you get first world, but not a superpower. More of a boastful power or a braggadocio power than a real one. Or Harris, who is not going to embark on radical change, she will begin the distancing process with Israel. Absolutely. She will not treat Putin with kid gloves. After all, she doesn't take orders from Putin, unlike a certain other person. And so I think she will renew U.S. assistance. And quite frankly, from what I'm seeing from the Poles, from the Finns, from the Swedes, they are not afraid of the Russians. They're not afraid of the bear. The U.S. might be. Again, we're all worried about nukes. But I have the feeling that the people like the Finns, who know the Russians the best and dislike them the most, are pretty confident that Russia would not risk a nuclear response by nuking one of the NATO allies. that simply people around Putin, again, we've talked about this. They have families, they have children,
Yeah.
is losing everything worth it over Ukraine? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So
And
I
but
think that the big hedge here, I would say, because you always hedge in politics, right? And you hedge in international
yeah.
relations. The big hedge, the big play is against desperation. We've got to find a way, just as we talked about, when you've got your your adversary cornered, you got to let him find for him an escape route, right? Let him out honorably, if you will. Well, the same thing occurs here. This increasingly desperate leadership have to be afforded something that lets them get out of their predicaments, at least over the short term, without the personal consequence that they so much fear. I don't say that you got to lie to them, but you pretty much got to do whatever is necessary to get them out of the way if you want, the broader issues to be resolved. And I had forgotten to mention just briefly, and I'll stop here with that. Remember, we talked months and months ago about the Buchanan brothers' rules and how one of them was when the dictator starts wearing capes, he's soon
Yeah.
to fall. Well, that was an aphorism for he's surrounded by yes men who are telling him what he wants to hear, but the reality outside the palace walls is not what he is hearing. Trump is in that predicament. Putin is in that predicament. Netanyahu is in that predicament. They're surrounded by people who are telling them, we can win. Everything's going well. Just continue, be a racist, be a misogynist, bash the migrants, tell the Russian people that everything's under control. That's the end. Okay, that's a sign of terminal decline. And I think that's what we have to realize is they are desperate. They are very dangerous in their desperation, but it's the end for them. It's the end. And, it might be, as a former lifeguard, I mentioned this before, it's like the last grasp of a drowning person. Their desperation is palpable in your hands, but you cannot pull them out of their predicament. Well, that I think is what's going on in this. And again, we won't get into it too much today, but, I talked about Maduro earlier. I've been looking at the case of Nicaragua, which I have a certain personal affinity for. Daniel Ortega, betrayer of the Nicaraguan revolution, all the promise of 1979, is now a tin pot dictator. But he also, Maduro's taken lessons from him. He's a repressor. He's gone after the Catholic Church. He scares his people. He no longer wants the consent of his people. But it's the end for him. He doesn't see it coming yet, but his actions speak of desperation as well. And so I would say that my biggest fear right now is that because they are desperate, and there are so many desperate actors in international relations, someone's going to make a mistake. Someone is going to miscalculate and will cause a war or a conflict or a genocide. I mean, I'm not sure where the ugliness and how the ugliness is going to materialize, but I'm increasingly sure that the ugliness will arise and we will face a major conflict of some sort in the very near future if these things are not resolved in a non-desperate way.
Well, let's hope for resolution. And thanks for this topic, Paul, that you raised and defined and dug into. And just remember to all those that are listening and watching this podcast that we've got the United States presidential candidate debates coming up this week in a couple of days' time from now while we're recording. That'll be very interesting, and a lot of the questions and scenarios perhaps that we have discussed today will either be able to be put to bed or heightened in issues of concern. So it'll be an interesting time this week, and I think also as we go forward, we are now, with the debates starting, we're in campaign proper. And what would be good, though, would be for Kamala Harris and her team to put her up for as many interviews as she possibly could. And that may actually satisfy some of those voters that are yet to commit, that they would know what a presidency under her would look like. And that would be an interesting outcome if they had the courage to have more interviews as opposed to none. On that point, Paul, I'll just say to the audience, thank you for being with us through the recording of this live podcast. I hope that it's been a rewarding time for you, and Paul and I will come back in a couple of weeks' time, no doubt, with another issue that we'll dig into and perhaps give pause for thought on many of those points that have been debated today. Until that time, take care. Ka kite anō. We look forward to your company again very soon. Goodbye.